Well, this is the third week of our series that we have been calling How to Be Rich. And we began this series by asking the question, what's rich? Who's rich? And typically we answer the question, well, I don't know. I don't know what's rich. I don't know who's rich. I just know it's not me. Rich is probably more than me. But as we discussed it, rich doesn't mean that. Rich doesn't mean more than me. Rich means more than enough. That's the definition that we've been relying upon. Rich means more than enough. More food in our refrigerator than we're going to eat today, more clothes in our closet than we need to stay dry and warm. Rich is having a day off and getting paid for it. Rich is communication and mobility and a hundred things we have that we don't need. They're more than we need. We have more than enough. And accepting that definition, then most all of us easily qualify for the tag rich. The problem comes in with the fact that we don't feel rich. We don't feel rich. And there are lots of reasons why we don't feel rich. Debt is one. Guilt. Conflict over money. Stress over money. Worry over money. None of those things allow us to feel very good about money. They rob us of the feeling of being rich. And as we've discussed, whatever the other reasons, probably there's one reason underneath all of them. And I think it's this. We don't approach money correctly. We approach money as something to get, as something to be gotten, as something to have and hold on to. But Scripture teaches us differently. Scripture teaches us to approach money as servants. Not servants of money, servants of God, responsible for money. Maybe some, maybe a little, maybe lots and lots. But however much, to be a follower of Christ is to recognize that all of it, everything belongs to God and is on loan to us. We have and hold it for Him. And we have and hold it in a stewardship for a purpose. And the purpose is investment in His kingdom. His kingdom, not ours, His. And our stewardship is a term of service. Eventually it comes to an end, after which the owner obviously wants to know, how'd we do? How'd we do with what He gave us? What kind of return are we making to Him for the investment He's made in us? Worldly rulers, worldly people use their money to invest in their kingdoms. And Jesus says, it cannot be that way with you. It cannot be that way with you. You and I have got to be all about investing in God's kingdom. And the easiest way to do that, and to do that consistently and consistently maintain that perspective, is just to act like servants. Just act like servants. Well, today we're going to continue along those same lines, looking at the same point from a slightly different angle. And to do it, we're going to look at a passage taken from the 12th chapter of Mark's Gospel. If you've been joining us these past weeks, we've been reading right along through Mark's Gospel, and now we're in the 12th chapter, and this is the very end of Jesus' life. And at the end of His life, there was a lot of contention, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of people who were trying to stir up trouble for Him. They would shout questions at Him and try to trip Him up and get Him in trouble. But then we read about an apparently sincere fellow who approaches Jesus with a good question. He says, of all the commandments, which is the most important one? Good question, because there were about 600 commandments in the Mosaic Law. And Jewish people, faithful Jewish people, tried to follow them, but that could become difficult, even tricky. And a lot of the religious leaders, especially at this point, were all about discussing and debating endlessly which were the most important laws, which went first, and then which were less important, and there was a lot of debate and discussion about that. So this fella comes up with a good question. Can you boil it down for us, just to give us a basic kind of indication of when we're on the right track and headed in the right direction? And Jesus apparently is pleased with this question, because he answers at length, and Mark tells us, the most important one, answered Jesus, is this one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Jesus answers the question by going to Scripture, and he relies upon a verse taken from the book of Deuteronomy. And this verse was far and away the most famous verse in all of Hebrew Scripture. It's so famous it actually has a name. Jews would call it the Shema Israel. I'm trying to pronounce that correctly because somebody corrected me. It was called the Shema Israel, and it was the centerpiece of Jewish prayer and worship, far and away the greatest commandment of all. So important that faithful Jews would say this waking up in the morning and say it falling asleep at night. It would be their wish and hope that it was their final words before they die, and the first words that they would teach to their children. These words were so strong and powerful for observant Jews. They had an emotional pull to them, because these words represented most profoundly who they are, what their history was, and what they were all about as a nation. Nobody in Jesus' audience would have argued with him when he answered the question in this way. Undoubtedly, this is the first, the greatest, and the most important commandment, except Jesus adds to it. He adds a last little bit onto it. He says the first commandment is love God. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. This also is a quote from Scripture, but a different book. Jesus is going now to the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is a very difficult book to read if you've ever tried. It's filled with lists and lists and lists of laws, all different kinds of laws. Laws that are straightforward and universally applicable, like don't lie, don't cheat, don't slander people. Laws that are obscure and difficult to understand, the laws that govern diet and hygiene at that time. And among all of these laws and list of laws, Jesus pulls out one. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not an unimportant commandment, to be sure, but certainly in Leviticus, one among many, until Jesus changes its status and gives it top billing. For observant Jews, there was no command like the first command. There was no law like the first law, and it didn't share top billing with any law. And now Jesus comes along and changes that. In fact, he makes the assertion that those two laws go together. And they have to go together. They can't even be separated. You can't even fulfill the first law without the second. You can almost hear some of the people in his audience scratching their heads saying, "What? What are you talking about? This is so unexpected, so shocking, such a paradigm shift for so many in that crowd that in fact Mark tells us from then on no one asked him any more questions." We don't want to ask you any more questions. We're afraid what we might hear. Now, from our perspective, the love part isn't really a big deal. I mean, theoretically anyway. We accept it at a theoretical level. Yeah, sure, love God, love your neighbor, whatever. Our problem isn't with the love part. Our problem is with the other part, the yourself. part. That's the part that we have a problem with. I mean, why did he have to put that word in there? Well, why do we need that word? Love God, love your neighbor. Okay, done, period. Let's go home. And then he puts that word in. Yourself. The yourself part gets in the way of the neighbor part. The yourself part gets in the way of the God part too. Yes, this past week was a pretty interesting week for lots of you. It was for me. Many of you perhaps have storm stories. I do not have a personal story. Fortunately, my power did not go off. I didn't even lose cable TV, so I was pretty lucky. I wasn't even paying much attention to the storm as it was approaching us on Monday. As it turned out, I had a pretty important project with a deadline of Monday evening that I had to complete. So most of Monday, I was sequestered away in my own little world trying to finish this project. And it was only Monday evening when I got home and turned on the news that I tuned in to the reality of this storm and began to recognize that it might be serious. It might be consequential. Then later on in the evening, I turned it on again. It was 9 o'clock. And I turned on CNN, and there's this fellow on CNN named Anderson Cooper. And if Anderson Cooper is out in the storm, that means it's a very serious storm. And Anderson Cooper is out in the storm, and he's shouting into his microphone, and he's up to his Prada boots in water, and he's shouting into the microphone, "The storm will definitely make landfall in South Jersey, south of Atlantic City and north of Cape May." Well, some of you know that I'm from New Jersey. And perhaps some of you also know that a number of years ago, my family, not me, but my family was very fortunate to acquire a beach house in New Jersey. And it's nothing fancy or special. It's just a comfortable old house. But it's kind of special to us because we've spent our vacations there and we spend our holidays there and Christmas is often there. So it's kind of special to us. And what you might not know is that that old beach house is in South Jersey, south of Atlantic City and north of Cape May. So all of a sudden, I'm like transfixed with this storm. It's like there's no other reality. I'm totally focused on this storm. I stayed up till 3 a.m. glued to CNN and Anderson Cooper watching this storm. And I'll be honest with you. I did not do a lot of thinking about how this storm was impacting anybody else. I was focused on how this storm was going to impact me. And even the next day, when we learned that the storm actually had a greater impact in North Jersey and New York, and that our little town, fortunately, had dodged the bullet, even then, my first reaction wasn't concern for the people in North Jersey. My reaction was relief for me. The yourself part. That's the part that gets in the way of the love part. The yourself part. And the yourself part always comes down to money and stuff we can buy with money. It always comes down to that. And over again, Jesus taught that the number one competitor to God, being our God and loving God by serving others, it isn't, the number one problem isn't the devil or evil or even sin. It's yourself. It's just the yourself part. He says in one place, no one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And Jesus was teaching this in a poor agrarian culture 2,000 years ago. If it was the case then, if he was concerned about that then, how much more so is it the case in our affluent community today? How much more concern will he have for us about this? Now. The yourself stuff. And I'll say this too, which is kind of uncomfortable to hear. The richer you are, the more stuff that you have, the more tempted you're going to be, the more pulled you're going to be, the more compelled you're going to be to let yourself and your money and your stuff get in the way. And I'm not saying this to make anybody feel guilty or bad. I'm saying this to challenge you when it comes to yourself and your stuff and your money. As long as it's in the way for all of us, why don't we just go ahead and use it strategically for what we're supposed to be doing? Love God, love people, use money. Love God, love people, use stuff. Maybe you have a vacation house. You could let somebody else use it, somebody who perhaps needs a break, instead of just using it yourself. Maybe you're thinking of ahead to the holiday season, and you're planning parties and dinners. Great, enjoy yourself. But how about if you also went out of your way to try and include on your invitation list somebody who's not on anybody else's invitation list? Maybe you have good stuff that you've collected, but it's stuff you're not actually using anymore, and somebody else could use it. How about if you just go ahead and give it to them instead of keeping it to yourself? You know, maybe you're fixing a batch of your special whatever, and instead of just fixing it for yourself, fix it for your neighbor too. Maybe you're thinking about buying a new pair of shoes or a new dress. Go ahead, treat yourself. But how about if you use that opportunity to make a donation to, say, a woman's shelter, and treated somebody else too? Or here's a really radical idea. Brace yourself. How about if one weekend you gave away your Ravens tickets? And let somebody else go instead of you. Love God. Love people. Use money. Use stuff. Use Ravens tickets. That's what rich people do.